Nature's Phoenix, second edition, is now available to purchase. It's packed with valuable insights on fire ecology, including the topics we'll be covering in this episode. If you're interested in learning more, you can find a link to purchase the book in the description below.
Welcome back to the webinar series, Chronicles from Nature's Phoenix, where co-authors Dr. Dominick Dellasala of Wild Heritage and Dr. Chad Hansen of the John Muir Project share the screen with other renowned wildfire experts.
Welcome to episode 5 of our Nature's Phoenix webinar series. In this episode, Dr. Dominick Dellasala and Luke Ruediger, Siskiyou Conservation Director at Klamath Forest Alliance, will discuss the imperative shift from ineffective wildfire management tactics, such as backcountry logging and fire suppression, to actual community protection measures.
Thank you all for joining us for the latest episode. I guess it's episode 5 in the Nature's Phoenix webinar series. This is, of course, based on a series of webinars connected with the new second edition of the book, Mixed Severities Fires, Nature's Phoenix. And today's webinar, the title of which is Rethinking Fire Management Beyond Backcountry Logging, is based on Chapter 10 of the book. That chapter is titled, Forest Managers Play the Backcountry Logging Fiddle as Towns Burn Down. That chapter, I'd really highlight that I think that's a distinct and particularly memorable chapter within the book, because it begins with one of our speakers today, Dominick Dellasala, telling his own story of the experience of when a big, intense fire came to his community, what that meant, and what are the lessons from that. So we're looking forward to hearing more about that today. He will be joined by our other speaker, Luke Ruediger, to discuss the imperative shift from ineffective wildfire management tactics, such as backcountry logging and fire suppression, to actual community protection measures. And I'm going to introduce each speaker right before their presentation, and then we'll save Q&A until after both of them have spoken. And as with previous webinars, I'll be conveying the questions that you've posted in the Q&A section of the Zoom page, not the chat, but the Q&A section. So please feel free to post your questions whenever they come to mind, and we'll get to those after the presentations themselves. So getting started, our first speaker is Dr. Dominick Dellasala. He is Chief Scientist at Wild Heritage, and he is former president of the Society for Conservation Biology North America section. He is an internationally renowned author of more than 300 peer-reviewed papers and 9 award-winning books on forests, climate change, endangered species, and speaking truth to power, and as well as being the editor of multiple scientific journals. He's also been widely quoted in the national media on forest and fire issues. Dominick has served on several committees, including the White House Task Forces on Forests and Oregon's Global Warming Commission Carbon Task Force, reporting directly to the governor on that. Dominick is motivated by his work to leave a living planet for his 2 daughters, 4 grandkids, and all those that follow. So let me turn it over to Dominick.
Thanks, Doug. And thank you, John Muir Project folks, for setting up these insightful webinars that have been laying out some of the key findings of the chapters of the book. But, before I get started, while I've engrossed myself in a career that is based on science, I think the issue of fires, especially in forests, have been the most challenging part of my 4 decades career because it touches people on a lot of levels. So I try to not only just focus on the science part of it, but the storytelling and the heartfelt aspect of what happens to forests when they go through a severe burning event. And I just wanted to open with 2 quick stories. One, the first edition of the book was inspired, back in 2011, when I just finished my rainforest book, my temperate and boreal rainforests of the world. I thought I knew what a forest was. And then shortly after the book, I took a hike with my then 8-year-old daughter to the top of one of the mountains where I live. that had experienced a severe fire, and we came out of an old growth forest that wasn't burned, and we went into the severe patch of a forest that had a lot of structure in place that was severely burned. And the place where we saw most of the biodiversity, contrary to what I would have thought at the time, was actually in the severe burn patch. And so at that point, I had to recalibrate my understanding of what a forest was, because I really was misinformed that it's just a patch of green old trees, which are really important, but so are the blackened trees as well. It's just a different community, but they're both important as part of what I've now coined circular succession. Life and death in the forest are joined through the process of renewal and aging, just like in humans. The second interesting story is what happened in the second edition of the book, which Chad and I spent a lot of time updating the different chapters and adding some new chapters that also had the latest science in it. But the really surreal part of that is on the day of the 2020 Labor Day fires, before the fires had even started, I was writing an op-ed warning about the alarming climate signals that I had been picking up, because I spent a lot of my hours on climate change modeling and tracking climate change on a regional level, and all the indications where we were going to have a burn. And I was worried that it was going to burn down Western towns. And halfway through the op-ed, my power went off. And naturally, even though my lines are buried, I went outside to take a look. And that's when I witnessed the burning down of my town, only a few 100 feet away from my doorstep. So that's the surreal part of this story that you'll be hearing today from me, and why I think a lot of the forest management is misguided, because it will not protect homes and prevent the kind of disasters that I had personally witnessed as a big advocate of climate change remediation and preparing for climate change. To witness something like that right out my door was just an incredible experience that led to chapter 10. And so I'm going to share my screen now and go into the science nuts and bolts, so you can see kind of some of the highlights of what we put together in chapter 10. And then I'm going to turn it over to Luke, and he's going to give you more of a local perspective on how this is playing out. All right, so let me just enlarge my screen here. Okay, you folks should be able to see that now. And so, yeah, so the second edition of the book, this chapter 10, what really inspired it was me witnessing what happened during the Alameda fire, which affected my community that I've been living in now for over 26 years. And what unfolded was really a climate-triggered event. And this is pretty much what we are seeing across the West these days. I've lived in this area for almost 3 decades now, and I remember what it was like when I first moved here. And now we don't have summers anymore, we have smoke season. And these smoke plumes get hung up in the jet stream, and they can travel long distances across the continent, as you can see in the imagery above, and then the graphic below it, in terms of the smoke plume influencing areas that have nothing to do with the origin of the fire, which is what makes me crack up whenever I hear organizations claim that by thinning in the backcountry, they're going to reduce smoke in the area where I live. And yet we're all part of a global airshed that's influenced by smoke as it gets into the jet stream. We get trapped by smoke that's coming from fires in British Columbia and as far south as, Southern California, and nearly every year. And it's related to an increase in wildfire activity from the graphs that you see there in relation to temperature, especially in the summer and the spring, as one of the factors. Okay, And so then you get these crazy things like this. People like Marjorie Taylor Greene claiming that we can control the weather. Well, we can't control the weather, but we are certainly messing with the climate. And there's a big difference between weather and climate that senators like the one you see below there holding a snowball bring to climate change hearings and claim that there's no such thing as, quote, global warming, end quote, not understanding the difference between climate and weather events. And even in the town nearby where I live, it says it's the climate. Yeah, it is the climate and it's changing. I've always wanted to kind of put a sign below that in Grants Pass that it's not just the climate, but it's changing. And some of the changes that we are seeing, which is why you can have snowball fights on the East Coast when the planet is warming generally, is because of the breakup of the polar vortex, as you can see in that graphic below the sign. When the polar vortex is breaking up, which is because of the Earth's uh, overheating from fossil fuel emissions and land use, it moves around. And so that's why you can have frigid temperatures in the Northeast, even though we're going through major climate change. So that snowball is because of the shift in the polar vortex. The thing that I really worry about now is the Atlantic Oceanic Current, which could shut down this decade. And Dr. James Hansen has a chapter in my Speaking Truth to Power book about how this could very much take place this year. And I just gave a keynote at the University of Plymouth in Great Britain on temperate rainforests. And I told them that I was worried that they could turn frigid within the next decade or so because the lack of the circulation coming out of the Gulf and warming the Great Britain islands, because that could shut down and then they would be stuck in a major freeze. So there are some major things going on. And what's really happening at the same time, which is exciting from the science standpoint, we're getting really good at climate attribute science. It's an evolving field of climate change modeling. It's getting very good at not only predicting how climate is going to affect natural processes, but at attributing the changes in those processes to even singular events. So we can kind of pinpoint how much of a recent major disturbance, like a hurricane, may have been supercharged by the overheating in the Gulf, and how our fires are being driven in part by extreme temperatures like heat domes. We had one in the Pacific Northwest in 2020, and then we had another one that is extreme in 2021. But that's what you can see there on that graphic is the location of heat domes over different time intervals in the graph, and each one of those high points you see on that graph is associated with a heat dome-like condition, and that relates back to wildfires burning. So we're seeing a strong climate signal from at least heat domes, and that signal is being amplified by how much logging has happened across the landscape. The other important factor is what's called the vapor pressure deficit. And another way of talking about that is droughts. Vapor pressure deficit is the amount of moisture that can be measured in the atmosphere at any given point in time. And so what you see there is a drought outlook map. And it's only for this most recent period. Looking forward, you could see those dark blotches are places that are in drought. Now, what I do is every February or so, I will look at this drought map and the outlook, and that pretty much to me will be a pretty strong indicator of where we're going to have very active fire seasons. The graph that you see on the right there is the association of forest fire activity, and on the x-axis, the vapor pressure deficit. The drier it gets, the more forests are burning in a particular area, to the point now that studies are showing anywhere from 40 to 100% of wildfire acre increases are being attributed to the vapor pressure deficit as a singular variable in these climate attribute studies. So there is definitely a strong climate signal that's behind a lot of our fire increases, and that is amplified when the area is heavily logged. The other important attribute that was taking place, I think, during the Alameda fire, which is the one fire that I experienced in 2021, was the distortion in the jet stream. And there isn't as much information on how climate change affects the jet stream, but it is hypothesized that the jet stream is being altered by overheating to the point where we're getting these strange wind events now in August and September, which one study showed that there was a cross-continental pattern of wind velocity, high wind speeds coming across the continent, when normally this time of the year we get our wind directions from the Pacific. And so that cross-continental flow, coupled with high winds, fan the flames of some of these big fire events. So what I'm getting to with this, and this is something that we discussed a lot in chapter 8, is that when I was first looking at fire ecology back in the early 1990s, when the whole forest health scandal was front and center in Congress, it was the classic fire behavior triangle. And now we have to look at it differently, because fire behavior is not an equilateral triangle influenced equally by fuel, topography, and climate. What's happening now is that the top-down driver of these big fire events is the climate, and extreme climate fire weather is driving these big fires a lot more than fuel. And of course, there's nothing you can do about topography, which is a factor involved in all these fires. But really what's driving the big ones is the climatic effects on fire weather. Okay, so back before the Alameda fire, my team took a look at how prone is the Ashland watershed, which is pretty close to where I live in Talent, to a fire event, and are they prepared? And at the time, we used LiDAR imagery of the Ashland watershed, and you can see those green squares and, those gray squares and rectangles in there. Those are houses that we could see with LiDAR, light impulse sensor array coming off the space shuttle. We're able to download and process that information in relation to vegetation touching structure. And so at the time, we warned the Ashland City Council that the Ashland watershed was primed to burn up. There were houses with vegetation touching structure. There were wood-shaped roofs. There were places where there was no room for fire trucks to back up or turn around. So instead of focusing on that, the Ashland City Council, working with the Nature Conservancy, Lomacotsi Restoration Project, and the Forest Service, put millions of dollars into backcountry logging, including heli logging, to remove dead trees that, once the needles drop, are really not a source of fire spread. So instead of putting the money where it was needed, we have unprepared communities in Ashland. And unfortunately, fortunately for Ashland, the Alameda fire didn't hit it. That whole town could have gone up in smoke if the winds were heading in a different direction. And at the time, this is what I was writing about. Okay, so now let's fast forward to the Alameda fire that happened in 2020. And you can see a map of Google Earth on the left there of the fire event. The fire, its origin point was in a park, a popular dog walking park in Ashland, started by an arsonist during those extreme climate fire weather events. And that other dashed arrow is where I live. And so it got dangerously close. to my house. But the sad part of it is it burned down most of my town. And that's what you see in that map that was produced by Esri there. So this was a record-setting, climate-enabled, extraordinary 2020 fire season that was priming this fire pump to unprepared communities. So all the alarm bells were ringing during the Alameda fire. It was the perfect firestorm of a drought with single-digit humidity that was taking place, extreme temperatures, and high cross-continental winds coming from the east. And so within hours, the fire raced from its origin point in Alameda Park in Ashland to 7 miles north to Talent, just a few blocks from where I lived. It jumped over 6 lanes of 2 highways, so much for fuel breaks. And by nightfall, it had destroyed 2,800 structures that were destroyed in 2 separate fire events, also started by arsonists. There was no early warning evacuation. Thousands of people were chaotically scrambling to get out of town. There was not well-defined escape routes. And it really was the homes and not trees were the main fuels. Meanwhile, the fiddling was happening in the backcountry, doing nothing to protect these homes because the homes were falling like dominoes, one after another. And the eerie part of it is where I was an evacuee for 10 days, at night during the fire event, you can hear the exploding propane tanks. It was like a 4th of July fireworks demonstration, but in a really bad way, because these were all mobile homes that were burning up. I learned a lot from this event. I learned that anomalies happen, which have no apparent explanation, like the entire mobile home complex with hundreds of homes burned down, and yet you see this child's treehouse carefully nestled in that tree that did not burn, and the whole surroundings were destroyed. There's another anomaly that you see in that other slide where it says Talent Strong. That house also was surrounded by a completely annihilated neighborhood, and there was vegetation touching structure. So it should have burned, but it didn't. And the only reason I can give for that is there was a nearby creek that laid the flames down, and the fire went around the house, and instead of destroying it. So that was really interesting. The other interesting part of it is that despite the fact that Talent has built back better, and I've been involved in a lot of the rebuild celebrations in my town, they're doing it in a way that is not prepared for the next fire event. And so there's no defensible space, there's no home hardening, and we have examples of fire striking in more than one, striking the same location more than once. And so we're hearing insurance companies pulling out of these towns now, whether you're in Florida with hurricanes or California with fires. This is an increasing likely scenario, and the towns are still not prepared. Okay, so I will say, I forgot to say one thing before moving on. I don't know what happened to that slide, but there was one really stark example of a church that was surrounded by burned down structures that did not burn. And at first I thought, wow, I wonder if this was divine intervention. And then I realized that what had happened was that church was completely fire hardened. It had hardy board siding. It had a metal roof. All the vents were screened with very fine screening filters. There was no flammable vegetation in the surroundings. They had double pane glass windows. They didn't realize it, but what they did was they insulated their church from that fire event, and it was a model for how we need to be building our communities back. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears, and this is going to be a segue into what Luke is going to be talking about. So the frustrating part of me witnessing my town burning down, in addition to the climate signal, is the emphasis, the misplaced emphasis on overselling, thinning, and burning. And groups like the Nature Conservancy advertised if they could do this over a very quickly period of time, they would reduce smoke in the valley. And of course, that's never happened, even though millions of dollars have been invested. And granted, they're only a few years into their program, but it's never going to happen because we live in a box canyon that traps air masses. So let's be at least realistic that you can only do certain things from the ground up. And what the TNC is doing is not helping. Their whole campaign is to let the sunlight in to these overly dense forests that need to be more open. So when they presented this to the community of Applegate, and Luke was a prime organizer of the meetings that took place, we presented them with hundreds of historical photos and historical accounts of closed canopy forest in places that they were calling open. Now, of course, the reason for that disagreement is apparent because if you can argue that most of your forests were open, then all these dense conifer forests are unnatural and need to be thinned. And that wasn't the case when we presented photos like what you're seeing there from historical periods. They also improperly set the fire suppression era at 1905, when most people believe fire suppression was mostly mechanized around World War II. And the main difference there is that the TNC could argue, well, any trees that have come in after 1905 should not have been in there in the first place, so we can take trees up to 120, 140 years old, which is, a lot of our mature, old fire-resistant trees in these forests. They did no analysis of logging and road impacts on fire behavior and fire starts, no analysis on invasive species, carbon, wildlife habitat impacts, and instead they targeted in their plan roadless areas, critical endangered species habitat, forest reserves, and the national monument. So instead of going into heavily logged areas that may benefit from some treatments, they targeted all the high conservation value areas that local conservation groups were in uproar about. And they do this through heavily biased collaboratives that are populated with timber organizations and thinning contractors, and that pretty much at the exclusion of local conservation groups. So here's some examples, and I know Luke is going to go into this, but these are the types of forests that TNC and their collaboratives are targeting. And it's not just what's happening in the Rogue Basin strategy of Southern Oregon, where this is currently playing out, but we're seeing examples in the Sierra, in the Santa Fe area, Eastern Oregon, and in other places that I hear from groups all the time. And so as a consequence, 154 grassroots and faith-based organizations tried to negotiate with TNC, but after 2 years of trying, we were ignored, and TNC's Fire Learning Network continues to be supported by U.S. Forest Service dollars, which to us represents a conflict of interest because they will never say anything negative about some of the collateral damages that their projects are inducing. And what was really frustrating to me about all of this is TNC is the richest organization in the US with a $1 billion operating budget. And yet they were outside my local grocery store trying to raise money with a display booth, asking people to help them, when local groups that work in this region are doing the lion's share of forest protection, and that now consider the Nature Conservancy as one of the top threats to public lands conservation. So I want to give a couple of more examples of what I'm seeing in other regions that involve collaboratives and also involve the Nature Conservancy that are being masqueraded as restoration when they're really degradation. I have a paper with a bunch of international scientists in review right now on this issue. It's what is restoration versus degradation. And we base it on ecological integrity reference condition, which a lot of these so-called restoration sites do not have, especially in the understory. And we base departures from reference conditions as to whether or not it's restoration or whether or not it's degradation and reduces integrity using a composite scoring of multiple stand level and landscape level factors that I don't have time to go into, but I'll show you some examples. So I just got back from the Santa Fe National Forest where I worked with some of the groups there on their degradation issues masquerading as restoration. And so what they are experiencing are overventilated, degraded forests that type convert a forest into a savanna. These pile burns that destroy soil horizons and mycorrhizae and that dry out the understory and that result in weed infestations and degraded landscapes. And this is also masquerading as restoration. And here are some examples using some imagery from the groups that I've been working with. That is this restoration or degradation. I think you can kind of look at what's happening here, that, yeah, those forests were open, but the agency, Forest Service, is going forward with this with no understory reference. So they base it on fire scar sampling, on tree density, but nothing on the understories. So they have no idea what was in the understory of these forests that are being greatly impacted. Here's some imagery that Bryant Baker did for us for our Santa Fe workshop that we did. This shows an area in the National Forest before it experienced fire and before it experienced the treatment. Then a fire came through in 2010, a year later, mostly in low and moderate severity effects on the vegetation. You can see in that browning. And this is what they did post-fire. So the fire already went through and did its natural thinning, and yet the Forest Service came in and over-thinned the forest. And you get these kinds of projects that are masquerading as restoration or resilience, supported by collaboratives. This one was a mistletoe restoration project that destroyed the forest, left these burn pile scars that will have a difficult time any native species coming back. That flowering plant you see in the foreground is exotic. It's mullein. It shouldn't be there. And yet this is being couched as restoration. We've seen a similar approach on the Stanislaus National Forest. Then JMP has been very involved with this. And Forest Service claiming that in these high severity burn patches on the left, you're not going to get conifer establishment or it's going to be delayed for decades. And yet you can see what's happening. And we've got the data to show this. Chad has done a lot of sampling, and so has JMP in these forests. On the right, you see a great gray owl nestling that's using these wildlife-rich, complex early xeral forests that supposedly need restoration. Again, here's another image of abundant conifer seedling establishment, and here's the data to support it. We published a paper in 2019 showing prolific conifer regeneration in the largest high severity patches. Now, I know climate change is a factor now, more so perhaps than it was when we were looking at those data sets, but there's still abundant conifer reestablishment in many of these high severity burn patches. They don't need logging and planting, which you can see from that graphic on the left. When you log a site, you disrupt that circular succession and you put it on a trajectory from rebirthing and aging of the forest to oversimplification through post-fire logging and tree planting that then burns up severely in the next big fire event. And there were TNC reps on our field trip to this the rim fire area on the Stanislaus that were pushing for logs to be sent to mills for biomass processing. Okay, so I'm going to end with a couple of slides here on what I think captures not only Chapter 10, but what was in my paper published in Biological Conservation in 2022 on is the Forest Service becoming contemporary Sisyphus and its collaboratives and affiliations in overselling treatments. So there are certain forms of thinning, mainly from below small trees, and prescribed burning, not pile burning, that can lower fire intensity in low to moderate fire weather. But you have to do everything right. You got to leave the large trees, you can't overventilate, and you have to have native understories. And likewise, cultural burning can be helpful, but it's not a panacea in a changing climate. It's necessary to get more fire on the landscape, but we are dealing with a situation that has never been witnessed before by humanity. And even if you do everything right, there's a low probability of fire intersecting the treatments when vegetation is reduced. And in order to scale up to increase the odds of that co-occurrence, you're going to be releasing more emissions that then contribute to the next series of fire and insect outbreaks through emissions to the atmosphere that are giving us these extreme climate-driven disturbances. We've seen examples of type conversions and increased collateral damages from scaling up activities, and a lot of it will be overridden soon by the climate top dog that's driving these big events. What we need to do instead is protect our natural climate solutions. We should not be doing these treatments in roadless areas, old forests, critical habitat, etc. And this is what really is behind a lot of the Nature Conservancy's projects, at least in my region. And we got to build back better. So as I mentioned, that church on the left was designed with fire risk reduction in mind, and the new rebuild is not. So we need to really redirect infrastructure money to defensible space and home hardening, bury the damn power lines. When they rebuilt my community, they didn't. In 1 month alone, we had 42 power outages because Pacific Power was claiming every day was a fire risk. And it's because they didn't bury their power lines. We got to move into getting off of fossil fuels. And as we prepare communities, evacuation routes need to be planned with warning systems in place, smoke shelters. And as far as TNC, a lot of the negotiations broke down with them when we tried for 2 years. And the only way to get them to change is to continue to expose this and the problems with their collaboratives and the need to reprioritize the areas that have already been logged for treatments and not the conservation areas. And in addition, to get TNC and the Forest Service to do a carbon life cycle analysis on the role that they're playing in putting more emissions into the atmosphere. I'm going to end on this slide and say that of all the things that I've worked on in my 4 decades, this is the most complicated one to solve. When I work in rainforest, I just have to solve for economics and work with the indigenous community to make sure that their values are upheld when we go for protected areas. Now, in the case of the dry fire-dependent forests, we've got an issue with fire phobia, rightfully so. Towns are burning down with smoke, human health, economics, and fire misinformation. So it's a big Rubik's Cube that needs to be solved simultaneous. And so what we've been doing is producing these eco-regional conservation assessments that's being led by my team at Wild Heritage. And we are uniquely integrating forest protection with fire risk reduction for communities and climate change planning so that we can set 30 by 30, 50 by 50, and 100% conservation target setting in the context of also preparing communities for increasing fires in a changing climate. And we break that down by multiple scales: ecoregion, the subregion, priority areas, focal species. All of that goes out for independent peer review. We've already published a number of these. Several of them are in the works, including working with Luke and his team. And then that is used to support for climate refugia proposals in several regions and in a public-facing online conservation atlas that explains all the science. And I'll leave you with this. That graph on the lower left there that we did in 2016 is still relevant. The areas that are experiencing the most uncharacteristic high-severity fire are the places that have experienced the most logging. It's not the places that need protection or that have been protected. So this is why we need to have an integrated approach that blends climate change planning, community fire risk reduction with protected areas going forward. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Doug to introduce Luke.
Great. Thank you so much, Dominic. And I just want to remind everyone to start posting questions in the Q&A section. We're going to do those after Luke's presentation, but anything that's on your mind right now, go ahead and post it. And with that, let me introduce Luke. Luke Ruediger grew up in Southwest Oregon and began exploring the region's unique habitat and terrain at an early age. Fascinated by the region's beauty and diversity, Luke has long worked to preserve, restore, and protect the ecological integrity of the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains through both environmental activism and land stewardship. Luke is the author of The Siskiyou Crest, Hikes, History, and Ecology, a hiking and natural history guide to the Siskiyou Mountains of Southwest Oregon and Northwest California. He also writes a blog about the Siskiyou Mountains and other regional land-based topics titled The Siskiyou Crest, Observations, Comments, and Perspectives. Luke is executive director of Applegate Siskiyou Alliance, a nonprofit dedicated to the conservation of the Applegate River watershed and Siskiyou Crest region in Southwest Oregon and Northwest California. And he also runs the Siskiyou office of Klamath Forest Alliance, where he acts as the Siskiyou Conservation Director, monitoring public land management, as well as activities related to running campaigns and advocating for habitats throughout the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains. So with that, let me turn it over to Luke.
So, hey, I'm operating off grid in the middle of nowhere, so I'm going to turn my video off to save data. So you will not be seeing me while I do the presentation, but you'll be seeing my slides instead. So I'm hoping everybody can see that. So in my work with both the Klamath Forest Alliance and the Applegate Siskiyou Alliance in the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains, I conduct extensive field monitoring of public land management activities throughout southwestern Oregon and northwestern California. So in that work, I see repeated examples, patterns, and trends that demonstrate the current approach to fire and forest management in the West, its many flaws, its impacts, and its real beneficiaries. This presentation provides real-world examples of misguided management activities either proposed or implemented on public lands in the region. So I'm going to focus heavily on what's actually going on out there on the ground in the Klamath Mountains. So in the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains, like many other portions of the country, the Nature Conservancy, so-called forest collaboratives, industrial interests, forestry contractors, and land management agencies like the Forest Service and the BLM are promoting what they call restoration, fuel reduction, or resiliency treatments. Yet in many cases, it is clear that political and economic incentives are driving that process. These incentives can be in the form of commercial timber sales, biomass production, federal contracts for private industry and forestry contractors, as well as both grant funding and political capital for nonprofit organizations. So ironically, forest collaboratives, which are run or heavily supported by federal land managers and the Nature Conservancy, have been detrimental to real public collaboration, inclusive land management planning, and conservation values in numerous ways. Number one, the collaboratives are exclusive and consist of organizations or businesses, both handpicked by federal land managers and supportive of the timber industry. Two, the work of collaboratives often occurs behind closed doors, with little public accountability or involvement, or public involvement, and the general public is not invited and not engaged. The agency's collaborative relationship it has become largely financial and transactional for both the agency and its NGO and industry partners. And four, collaborative partners are promoting a streamlining of the process to increase the pace and scale of land management activities that support their bottom line. This nearly always means cutting out scientific review, NEPA analysis, and public comment periods. So forest collaboratives, in my view, are a form of public land privatization. And many national forests, including the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, have essentially replaced the public in federal land management planning processes with forest collaboratives. Yet the collaborative partners maintain far less independence and far less ability to speak freely or in opposition to activities proposed than the general public. Forest collaboratives create exclusive partners with significant vested financial interests, and then require silence to maintain these financial arrangements. So we support open, transparent public collaboration, not exclusive collaboratives, which are used to control the narrative, create an appearance of consensus, often where one does not exist, and to support predetermined outcomes that lean heavily towards commercial timber production on federal lands. Locally, numerous organizations involved in forest collaboratives have been approached by residents and activists in the region asking if they would publicly oppose non-restorative or damaging aspects of federal land management planning projects. On each occasion, we have been told that their relationship with the agency does not allow them to critique, oppose, or question agency actions. Contracts would be lost, future grant funding forfeited, and political influence diminished, as well as their access to the public lands. So support for logging has become a litmus test for partners wishing to participate in forest collaboratives on federal land management planning processes. And while those that question logging, active management, and even just some forms of federal management are actively marginalized, ignored, and excluded. At the same time, federal land managers in Southwestern Oregon are specifically approving projects for nonprofit partners that conduct analysis, monitoring, public outreach, public relations, media, and messaging campaigns for federal land management agencies, and for private contractors who are designing and implementing their own prescriptions on federal lands, marking their own trees for removal, hauling those trees to the mill, and using the proceeds to create more work on federal land for their for-profit businesses. So the concept behind this form of management is based on the control of nature, the continued suppression and demonization of natural processes, and the replacement of these natural processes with industrialized forms of management, including landscape-scale logging and widespread vegetation management operations. So this form of management has proven ineffective and simply cannot be implemented at scale. Yet if implementation was ever scaled up as proposed by federal land managers, the impacts would be enormous and long-lasting. Increasingly, federal land managers are proposing massive restoration logging projects, including the BLM's IVM project, which includes an over 600,000-acre treatment area across the entire Medford District BLM. So here in the Rogue River watershed, the Nature Conservancy and so-called Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative, or SOFRUC, have developed the Rogue Basin Cohesive Forest Restoration Strategy, known locally as the Rogue Basin Strategy. It has become controversial due to its industrial approach to land management and its impacts on true public collaboration and inclusive land management planning. SOFRUC and the Nature Conservancy have been promoting the Pilot Joe timber sale implemented on BLM lands in the Applegate Valley as an example of restoration-based forestry. So the photo on the right is a large group selection clearcut logged in the Pilot Joe project, while the photos on the left show a portion of the large tree removal that occurred, including trees, Douglas fir trees up to 42 inches in diameter. So the Rogue Basin Strategy was developed by SOFRUC, but it was funded by the BLM, the Forest Service, the Oregon Department of Forestry, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, Jackson and Josephine County in Oregon, and the Nature Conservancy. All of these organizations or agencies promote or have clear ties to industrial logging, while the board of directors for the Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative has at times included forestry contractors, the former head of the Southern Oregon Timber Industry Association, former BLM employees, and others professionally invested in commercial logging. Now a new entity with all the same players, the Rogue Forest Partners, has emerged to implement industrialized landscape scale management activities throughout the region. And it has been partnering with federal land management agencies to do so. So this slide shows the partners in the Rogue Forest Partners. So the Rogue Basin Strategy was designed specifically to influence federal land management and to increase the scope and scale of treatment, including commercial logging on public lands. The proposal would treat up to 5 times more land than is currently subjected to logging or manual fuel reduction on an annual basis. and nearly half of this acreage would include commercial logging. So they're proposing 475,000 acres of logging in 20 years, or 24,000 acres per year. The level of harvest would create 66 million board feet annually and 1.3 billion board feet of timber over 20 years. So increasing the scope and scale of treatments as proposed in the Rogue Basin strategy would also dramatically increase timber harvest on public lands. These photos show examples of logging that has relatively recently been implemented by the Nature Conservancy and its Southern Oregon partners. So old forests are prioritized for treatment at twice the rate of young, heavily altered plantation stands in the Rogue Basin strategy. And the strategy would also encourage treatments and logging in and around northern spotted owl habitats. So this is pushing logging treatments on federal land into older, more intact habitats. And these photos demonstrate the types of forests targeted under this approach. In these photos, only the trees marked yellow would be retained if logging was to occur. So you can see in the quote above, SOFRUC and the collaborative partners believe that logging is a form of old growth forest protection. But based on real world outcomes and timber sale marks, we strongly disagree. So proposed treatments in the Rogue Basin strategy would target late successional stands and would reduce canopy cover to between 42 and 54% on average. But the strategy would also allow for reductions to below 30% canopy cover. This means northern spotted owl habitat would be removed or degraded during logging operations. It also means an increase in fire risks due to extensive even-aged shrub and tree regeneration following canopy reduction. The Rogue Basin strategy includes no upper diameter limit and no stand age limits. The goal is to quote unquote balance successional stages and vegetation mosaics by converting supposedly excess stands of closed canopy late successional forest into more open stand conditions. This essentially requires heavy industrial logging and significant large tree removal. So the Old Lickety timber sale here, the photos here, were maintained to similar canopy cover levels and led to extensive post-logging canopy loss, beetle outbreaks, drought stress, mortality from wind throw, and large portions of this sale were recently salvage logged due to the extensive post-logging mortality that occurred. The Rogue Basin strategy also proposes commercial logging in high-value conservation areas, such as the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, inventoried roadless areas, botanical areas, research natural areas, LSR forests, and other areas on Forest Service and BOM lands where timber harvest is either currently prohibited or limited by administrative designations. Logging in these areas would compromise decades of conservation efforts in our region. And the Forest Service and BOM are actively using the Rogue Basin strategy to justify logging in these more intact environments. So how are federal land managers using the Rogue Basin strategy? Well, it led directly to the development of the Pickett West timber sale, which proposed 6,000 acres of logging in the Rogue, Applegate, and Illinois River watersheds. This logging proposal was, quote, developed by the BOM with the Rogue Basin strategy in mind, end quote, which led to a project where 48% of the proposal was located in stands between 180 and 240 years old. FOIA information shows that the Nature Conservancy ecologists were working with the BOM to craft the environmental assessment and to justify the old forest logging proposed. So in these photos, you can see the types of stands proposed for logging in the Pickett West timber sale, which was ultimately withdrawn due to public opposition and to its impact on the red tree vole, a major prey source for the northern spotted owl. So these same collaborative partners are also supporting the IVM project on BOM lands. The alternative ultimately chosen in the IVM project was originally called the, quote, adapted Rogue Basin strategy alternative, and would allow up to 20,000 acres of commercial logging and 90 miles of new road construction per decade within an over 600,000 acre treatment area. SOFRUC comments on the IVM project praised it as an ambitious and well-crafted proposal and applauds the scale and vision of this endeavor. And one of their main recommendations was to quote, avoid diameter limits. So this translates into support for large tree removal beyond the 36-inch diameter cap proposed by the IVM. And this project was identified by conservationists as one of the 10 worst timber projects on federal lands in the country from a climate and carbon storage perspective. It was also successfully litigated by local conservation interests, with a judge declaring that this project, quote unquote, sacrificed habitats for commercial logging. So despite what may or may not be the intentions of groups like the Nature's Conservancy, the result of the funding, public messaging, and political pressure they are applying is to increase timber production on federal lands, increase the removal of old trees on federal lands, and to provide a greenwash under which federal land managers can propose mature and old-growth forest logging under the guise of restoration or fuel reduction. So this is being done on every timber sale shown here in the slide and on every timber sale on public lands in southwestern Oregon. So the approach is often described by its advocates as benign or as beneficial and is encouraged on the landscape scale. But this approach also includes many impacts, and these impacts increase as land managers are actively expanding the pace, scale, and intensity of their activities on the landscape. These impacts include large tree removal, the degradation of mature and old-growth forests, northern spotted owl habitat downgrades or removals, extensive carbon loss, new road construction, noxious weed spread, sedimentation, and soil damage. All of these impacts regularly occur in timber sales or so-called restoration projects on both Forest Service and BLM lands. Although environmental assessments and other NEPA documents often unrealistically claim these projects will have only beneficial effects, many of the impacts are inherent to commercial logging and vegetation management processes, and they occur whether the agency calls the project a logging project, a restoration project, a fuel reduction, or a resiliency project. So despite the overly optimistic claims in NEPA analysis, the impacts associated with commercial logging are extensive, real, and becoming more widespread. So although land managers often also claim to be emphasizing treatments in unhealthy, overly dense forest stands with their commercial logging, in many situations, the agency is actually targeting relatively open-spaced but closed canopy stands of mature and old-growth forest that are naturally resilient to fire, drought, and beetle outbreaks, and represent high-quality northern spotted owl habitat. These stands do not need and will not benefit from the proposed restoration logging treatments, and will in fact be heavily impacted by large tree removal, canopy reduction, yarding damage, and other impacts associated with commercial logging. So in fact, it is routine for federal forest managers to target mature, late successional, and old-growth forest habitats for commercial logging under the guise of restoration. So a few examples here: the South Fork timber sale and the Backcountry timber sale, just like the Crawford timber sale before them, is being proposed in some of the last occupied northern spotted owl habitat in the western half of the Klamath National Forest. And those timber sales are targeting some pretty nice old stands that even Fish and Wildlife identified as high quality owl habitat. The Cedar Flat timber sale is currently being proposed by the Medford District BLM in some of the last old growth in the Williams Creek watershed here in southwestern Oregon. And the Upper Briggs Restoration Project and the Secret timber sale includes old forest logging in a key watershed and important fishery for the Illinois River. So this project was proposed to address overblown concerns surrounding future high severity fire events, which the EAA claimed was inevitable due to fuel loading and canopy closure. Yet the area burned at 80% low severity just months before project approval. And the project moved forward because low severity of fire effects reportedly did not create the specific stand structure forest managers required, and according to agency documents, did not burn with enough intensity, create enough mortality, or sufficiently open forest stands. So the Secret timber sale was recently canceled due to monitoring by the Klamath Forest Alliance that found live trees up to 53 inches in diameter marked for removal. But the Forest Service hopes to repackage and reoffer this sale with trees over 40 inches in diameter identified for logging, and proposes to use this sale as an example of why large tree removal might be needed in forest restoration projects. So, every timber sale that I've monitored on public lands in the last 20 years has included an old growth or old forest logging component. These types of projects are being proposed in nearly every portion of the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains and beyond. And although the agency often claims they are restoration or fuel reduction projects, commercial timber production is often a dominant feature of project planning and design. Old forest logging is regularly included in these projects to increase profitability, to encourage potential purchasers to bid on timber sales, and to meet arbitrary stand density, basal area, and canopy cover requirements. Another thing we're seeing a lot of recently is group selection logging, which is a form of clear-cut or regeneration logging. And it's being increasingly proposed on federal lands and embraced by local restoration interests, including the Nature Conservancy. So this form of logging specifically targets old and mature stands with a form of staggered clear-cut logging, creating clear-cut openings up to 4 acres in size and across up to 30% of a given stand. So on BLM lands, this means that 3 in every 10 acres are essentially cleared of all trees under 36 inches in diameter and approximately less than approximately 160 years of age. The goal is to remove mature trees and replace them with young regeneration and early seral habitat. But according to BLM's own analysis, these prescriptions will create brush and fuel types that are, quote, more volatile and susceptible to high rates of fire-caused mortality. Stands could exhibit higher flame lengths, rates of spread, and fire intensity. Fires started within these stands could be difficult to initially attack and control, end quote. They also found the overall fire hazard would increase in these stands. And in southwestern Oregon, northwestern California, and in fact in many forests across the West, implementing group selection logging or heavy thinning that reduces canopy cover or removes large fire-resistant trees often leads directly to increased fire risks through stand drying, increased heat loads, increased wind speeds, an aggressive shrub response, and an increase in fine flashy fuels. Under extreme weather conditions, these treatments are very susceptible to high severity fire effects and will increase the rate of spread across the landscape. In the Applegate River watershed on BLM lands and in the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, we've also seen stands previously treated with commercial thinning and forest health prescriptions become the center of large-scale flat-headed fir borer outbreaks in 2016, 2022, and 2023. So rather than promoting stand resilience, the previous thinning prescriptions appear to be interacting with climate change and prolonged drought cycles to become the most susceptible portions of the landscape to beetle mortality. So the map on the left shows overlap between beetle mortality and previous commercial thinning operations on BLM lands following a 2016 outbreak in the Middle Applegate Valley. So the dark-colored polygons are treatment areas, and the hashed areas are mortality areas. After these mortality events occurred, they've been followed up with post-disturbance logging on BLM lands and also in the Ashland City watershed. So one project is the Lickety Split timber sale, which removed both live and dead standing trees in affected stands, creating vast clear-cut openings. And the Medford District BLM is also proposing to log both dead standing trees and snags that survived, or dead standing snags and living trees that survived the beetle outbreak. So this includes extensive areas of living forest that the agency is claiming is dead and dying. Yet many of the proposed units were largely unaffected by recent mortality outbreaks. In the Boaz salvage timber sale, trees and stands that survived recent beetle mortality outbreaks would be clear-cut, retaining only 3 trees per acre. This includes areas of drought and beetle refugia, including north and northeast facing slopes, canyon bottoms, and other areas that are naturally more moist and resilient to beetle outbreaks. And then finally, many advocates of active management also support post-fire logging, which significantly impacts soils, habitat conditions, noxious weed spread, and reduces habitat complexity for many decades. And what this does is starve future stands of snags, downwood, and biological legacies. So high severity fire creates a pulse of snags and downwood that, if removed, will dramatically impact future forest conditions and forest regeneration. Post-fire logging is nearly almost always implemented as clear-cut logging and includes artificial tree planting and plantation development that will increase fire risks and simplify forest structure going forward. So this approach must be questioned on federal lands and reversed if we are to sustain healthy forest, intact fire regimes, biodiversity, and habitat connectivity on the landscape scale. But I also wanted to point out that it's not just commercial logging that's damaging habitats on public lands. Non-commercial fuel reduction can also have significant impacts, especially on non-forested plant communities like oak woodland and chaparral. So chaparral habitats are often converted to non-native grassland through thinning and burning operations, while relatively intact oak woodland is often degraded into savanna form oak habitat and is often heavily invaded by non-native annual grasslands following these treatments. So these treatments in these habitats can and have been shown in scientific research in the Applegate Valley to be spreading cheatgrass, Medusa head grass, and other species that can increase fire risks, outcompete native plant communities, and alter ecosystem functionality. So the current approach that we've been taking has proven very costly from both an economic and ecological perspective. It's proven to be ineffective at protecting communities from wildfire. And federal land management agencies are quite literally logging the backcountry where towns burn to the ground. In fact, every dollar spent and every project proposed in remote proportions of the national forest and BLM lands represents the abandonment of communities in need and takes the emphasis away from real community wildfire and climate protection. So for example, the 2020 Alameda fire, which Dominick talked about, ripped through the Rogue Valley in southwestern Oregon. It ran from house to house through developed areas, burning almost 3,000 homes, including my mom's home in Talent, Oregon. Meanwhile, tens of millions of dollars were spent logging remote locations in the Ashland Creek watershed, including research natural areas and inventoried roadless areas, reportedly to protect surrounding communities. Yet the biggest vulnerability was within the developed and built environment, which continues to be neglected. These communities need support and a more effective approach to community wildfire protection. Currently, federal land managers and forest collaboratives are not offering that support, at least in our region. So at the Klamath Forest Alliance and Applegate-Siskiyou Alliance, we promote a home outward approach that allows land managers to focus on the protection of communities, the hardening of homes and infrastructure, and minimizes the significant impacts to wildland landscapes associated with this more widespread backcountry approach. The safety and protection of human infrastructure provided by this home outward strategy would reduce home losses during wildfire events, just like it did in the 2024 bridge fire in Southern California, where home hardening led to very high home survival rates in the town of Wrightwood, California. Federal land managers at this point are just failing these communities, and they're failing the land. We need a new focus and a vision for forest, fire, and carbon management in the West. This new emphasis should prioritize home and community fire protection and safety. It should focus thinning, prescribed fire, and fuel reduction efforts directly around homes and communities to create defensible space. It should also emphasize natural carbon storage by protecting mature and old-growth forests and allowing natural processes through managed wildfire to shape ecosystems and backcountry habitats. Both the value of this approach and of mixed severity fire is articulated in the newest version of Nature's Phoenix. And the impacts of our current approach, they're very real and they're extensive. While the benefits of this home outward approach to both the environment and to communities cannot be overstated. It's time to move on to more effective solutions for these forests and for these communities. And it's time for this home outward approach. So I'm going to leave it at that. Just no more logging in the backcountry while towns burn down. We need to take a different look and a different approach at this issue. So that's what I have, and I'm going to stop sharing here. So
great. Thank you so much, Luke. Okay, so now we're pivoting to the Q&A time. If anyone has new questions to add, please post them in the Q&A section, and I'll try and get through what I can in the time we have available. What I'd like to begin with is I noticed that there were 3 questions all related to the Nature Conservancy dimension of both of your presentations. So I'm going to ask all 3 of those questions at once because I think you might want to they might be interwoven in your answers. So the first one was, can you speak more deeply into why TNC is acting in such an irresponsible and shallow ways, how they've ignored so much of the science? What are they getting out of this? As a huge enviro, you'd think their reputation would matter, but more than that, why be siding with industrial timber? Another person asks, is there a compendium of TNC's revenue streams from the Department of Agriculture and Forest Service available somewhere? It's all about the dollars, of course. And there was a third question. Let me scroll down. Where'd that go? Yes. Here in Washington State, a number of state agencies have TNC staff seated at the table as members. Often the public can only listen, not participate in the meetings. Do you know if the concerns you raised about TNC are across the entire organization or specific to forest issues? So those are three aspects of questions about TNC. Dominick, Luke, are there things you'd like to share beyond your presentations to answer those?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one because, as you know, Doug, I was part of the 154 groups that spent 2 years trying to negotiate and meet with TNC at the highest levels. And that, by the way, this is not the first time that TNC has been working at cross purposes with the NGO community. It happened a number of years ago too, over the issue of protected areas as being too anthropocentric. And we got into a big tussle with them as well. I think, as I pointed out, this is a billion-dollar organization that, in my view, has experienced mission drift because they're so swimming in the cash, have a lot of corporate interest on their board, are dipping into federal dollars for their fire learning circle, although it's hard to figure out how deep that pocket is because TNC doesn't report that revenue, and it's not apparent in their revenue stream reporting. So it's really a difficult thing to track down. But since they're involved in so many of these collaboratives and they're teaming on so many of these Forest Service projects, there's got to be a connection to the funding stream there. As to the science issues, I think this gets down to perspectives. Depends on how you see the forests, right? If you see the forest as a living ecosystem that is going to experience these rebirthing events, and then is going to age over time, and all of that is circularity in nature, you're going to look at and design studies with different testable questions in mind. Then if you're looking at a forest as if it burns severely, that's not good fire, we got to stop it. So let's design approaches that attempt to do that. And so in a lot of TNC's marketing, they overstate the importance of what they think is good fire, which is mostly a low intensity burn, and bad fire, which is mostly a high severity burn. So they want more of the good and less of the bad. So it's a complete oversimplification of ecosystem processes and the connection to mixed severity fires in nature's phoenix. And I think they see it the way they want to see it. And that's where their science goes. There's a lot of good people in TNC that are working on some classic conservation measures. But my experience is that the Fire Learning Center is not on board with some of the things that we're talking about here and presents itself as one of the top threats on public lands.
I would just add that, it's pretty simple from what I can tell, at least in my region. It's money, it's political influence, and it's millions of dollars in grant funds that are flooding into these forest collaboratives that have strings attached. The federal agencies, as we have seen many times, do not allow dissent within the collaborative framework. So basically, groups are taking this money, they're getting access to public lands. They often have to have forest supervisors or district rangers or whatever sign off on their grants and get approval to work on those federal lands. And now federal land managers are essentially designing projects specifically for those project partners. So really, it's corporate and federal money. It's these big grant funds that are allowing these forest collaboratives to essentially buy influence and to drown out the voices of other, conservationists and other folks that want to be involved in public land. So ironically, these collaboratives are in our area actually have been sort of the death of collaboration on public lands. And the public has been pushed out of the process and minimized, largely because there's just so much money, so much influence, so much access to media. And that money also buys political influence. So when you look at the goals of these organizations, the Nature Conservancy has largely shifted from conservation to policy, and that money and that influence dramatically influences their ability to affect policy. And their cozy relationship with the industry does as well. So I think there's just, you look at their priorities, and the priorities have become political with the Nature Conservancy, and they have a huge amount of money, and they're using that to kind of wash out and override more public and conservation-based interests that want to be involved and want to have influence on public lands.
By the way, if you want to find out more about this and the effort to reach out to the Nature Conservancy, go to the Dogwood Alliance website and query the Nature Conservancy, and you'll see the efforts that we tried and some of the articles that have been written in the popular press exposing some TNC greenwashing programs.
And I would add to that another resource that Jen has posted in the chat is there's the Nature Conspiracy report, which also includes the sign-on letter that Dominick mentioned involving groups from around the country. So if you have not seen that report, go to the chat section right now, and Jen had posted it there. So thank you on that. Moving on topic-wise, there's a question. In response to the Alameda fire, what home hardening measures were adopted by local authorities to reduce the threat of future fires to homes?
Yeah, I'll field that one because I live in the community, and I've tried for quite a while to get home hardening built into the rebuild, and unfortunately, none of it happened. And I think it's because FEMA rushed in and put up, rightfully so, a lot of livable shelters, because a lot of what was lost was in mobile homes. And then what I personally witnessed was a shift towards higher end units, with folks either using their insurance money or selling their property to developers that came in with these high-end condos that just is adding to gentrification of my community and the lack of any home hardening structures. And in addition, the power company ignored our request to bury the power lines. So now that we're getting during the summertime, as I mentioned, in just a 2-week span, we had 42 power outages, with Pacific Power claiming that every time we had the whimper of any wind or a squirrel on the line, they shut down the lines because of liability issues that they're facing in California over sparks coming from fallen lines that they should be burying. So they missed an opportunity here to bury the power lines, and the builders just went in and built on the cheap instead of doing home hardening. And who knows what'll happen with the roll of the dice in the next fire event, as the climate is giving us more of these reoccurring fires in the same footprints. We've seen that a number of times in California. So it's really sad that it went that way. We tried with the state politicians to get more money emphasized in the build back parts, and there's infrastructure funding that's not being spent that should be in that regard. The only good news out of this is that some of our local representatives have come around to the idea of putting more money into the infrastructure issues and not into the backcountry logging. So I think they witnessed what experienced in my community as a need to maybe change direction and put more money into community preparation, and not just into the backcountry logging that's doing nothing.
See. Anything you want to add, Luke, or should I move on?
I think Dominick did pretty well with that.
Great. Here's a question tapping into the climate dimensions, referencing a recently published article about land-based ecosystems are losing their carbon sink status. Do you have an effective argument for continued forest protection, even though many forest ecosystems are becoming carbon sources?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is inevitable in some areas, because I spend a lot of time working on downscaled climate change projections, and especially in the places where we're doing these ecoregion conservation assessments, the type shifts are forecasted mid to late century, and all of our models are underestimating the speed at which climate change is advancing. But having said that, the best natural climate solutions that we have are still our intact natural ecosystems, whether those be old forests, which have the highest carbon density, or other natural vegetation types and landscapes. Those are our best hope for natural climate solutions. They're irreplaceable. So even though areas are shifting and are going to temporarily be a sink loss to more carbon emissions, something else will come in, and that vegetation will therefore become a future sink. So the important thing is to protect the area so that it can go through those changes while reducing anthropogenic stressors to allow the potential for climate refugia to be out there and protected on the landscape. This is what we're working on with the groups in Northwest Montana and with Luke's group on the Siskiyou Crest, is identifying those places that can function as climate refugia that will retain their climate attribute properties as the surroundings change more drastically, and that will hold onto their carbon for a longer period of time. So what we're looking at is hang time while the surroundings change more quickly. And we do know that those surroundings that have been clear-cut logged have much higher temperatures, much more drought problems than the interior of an old forest that can function as a climate refuge and give us some hang time until we get our shit together and get off of fossil fuels.
It's a question that I think might go to Luke. The person writes, here on the Shawnee National Forest, the Forest Service is using categorical exclusions to avoid doing EAs or EISs on logging projects because CEs can be used on projects less than 70 acres and involving less than a half mile of road building. So now they're eating our forest one small bite at a time. How do we counter and overcome that?
Well, that's a tough one. I'm seeing similar dynamics here, especially on Medford District BLM land, where I talked about in the presentation, they're doing these post-disturbance logging categorical exclusions that are up to 250 acres and a half mile road construction. And what they're doing is kind of this dishonest narrative where they're targeting the stands that made it through the beetle outbreaks and calling it, salvage logging. So it's a problem that we have. I think that the public needs to just speak up and express their interest in maintaining real, meaningful public involvement on federal lands and, maintaining scientific review in projects. It's kind of ironic that as the climate's changing and shifting and we're having all these, new and emerging issues kind of evolve in our habitats, that we're just not doing the analysis to determine what the impacts of the projects that we're doing might have on those systems and on those resources. But ultimately, honestly, I think what needs to be done is, it's political to some extent and legal on another. So the use of those categorical exclusions needs to be challenged in court, but it also needs to be challenged in the court of public opinion and with our elected officials who are allowing those big loopholes to exist and are allowing our federal land managers to degrade our public lands one categorical exclusion at a time. So I think it's they have to be fought publicly and they have to be fought in the courts. They also have to be brought into the political sphere, and we need to make it clear that public lands should be managed for the public and the public should have a role in that process, and categorical exclusions are cutting the public out. That's who they're excluding. They're excluding review, they're excluding the public, they're excluding public involvement.
Thanks. And I just add to that, in California, with California National Forest, there have been some very helpful legal victories in recent years around the use of CEs, the abuse of CEs in this regard. Unfortunately, what we've seen more recently from the Forest Service now is a pivot to even larger, just mind-bogglingly large projects being done under just an EA. And Luke's group, among others, are currently involved in litigating one that involves a project across 9 national forests and I believe hundreds of thousands of acres. So there are tools for challenging the CE piece, but be aware that the Forest Service will then probably pivot to trying to do very big things under EAs, which is a separate problem.
The Medford District BOM is trying to do what they call programmatic NEPA analysis. And so they're taking this massive 600,000 acre treatment area. They're saying these are the kinds of activities we're going to implement on this landscape, but they're not identifying spatially or in a site-specific manner where those treatments might occur. So in my opinion, the analysis is pretty meaningless at that scale. But that's another way that they're trying to get around this public involvement piece and the scientific review and NEPA analysis, is doing these programmatic approaches that once they get approval through the programmatic NEPA, they legally do not need to do site-specific project level review. That's being challenged, and some of the court cases are looking pretty good. But that is another way that they're trying to get around the process and increase the pace and scale of what they're calling restoration, which is in many ways actually just commercial logging.
We're almost out of time here. I'll try and get one more question in before we go, which is, someone said, if I were to cut down all the trees around my house, the surrounding microclimate would become much warmer and leave the house and surrounding property vulnerable to fire. What does that mean for your definition of defensible space? And I would add to that, what do you say to the public perception that working on defensible space means clearing all the trees around your house?
Yeah, it doesn't. And there are ways to do it effectively without chopping down all your trees. You just don't want any upper branches touching structure. You want to make sure you've got no flammable vegetation on the ground that's close to structure. I mean, anytime you have trees around your house, you're taking a risk. There's no way around that. But you can reduce that risk by making sure you have pruned properly and you've screened your vents, especially because embers can get in even if you've done everything right. We've seen examples of that in the Alameda fire, where a structure that was built with a steel roof or a metal roof and cinder block burned to the ground. It was a auto repair shop that probably didn't have the right screens. So embers got in there, ignited presumably the chemicals, and the whole place blew up. So doing the right amount of home hardening doesn't mean that you need to cut down everything around your house, but it does mean that you need to be really aware of the risks that you're taking if you don't do proper home hardening and defensible space management.
And I would just say that I actually have done defensible space work professionally for many years. I think it can be effective, but it can be overdone. So it's a matter of, you don't need to clear areas. You need to be very targeted about looking at the home ignition potential. And oftentimes that may mean maintaining some canopy cover and some trees around the house, because, you're going to, although vegetation is somewhat of a risk on any level, vegetation is always going to exist on the landscape. And if you're trading, tree canopy and a relatively, open understory adjacent to your home for dense vegetation, then you're increasing the maintenance that's going to need to be done directly adjacent to your house. So it's not that things need to be cleared, and it's not that you need to clear a huge distance from the house, but you need to be very cognizant of what the home ignition potentials are. A lot of that has to do with home hardening. But by reducing some of the vegetation around your home, you're also enabling yourself to operate a little more freely around the home if a fire event, is threatening the house. So it's trade-offs, and a lot of times people take it too far. It's not about clearing, it's about targeted removal to achieve specific home protection measures. And I think that that's important to keep in mind.
Great. Thank you both on that. Thank you both again for wonderful presentations. To the audience, thank you for all the great questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to more of them, but we are out of time at this point. Before we go, I just wanted to remind you that the next and final webinar in this series will be in 2 weeks on Wednesday, November 6th at noon Pacific time. And the speakers will be Dominick Dellasala and Chad Hansen. And the topic will be megafires, catalysts for ecological renewal. So I hope you can join us for that. And as a reminder, please get the book. It's a tremendous resource, link in the website, and much of what Dominick described in the talk today. He tells even more of that story in the chapter in the book. So check that out. Thanks again to all of you, and have a good day.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.